Good morning, everyone. Welcome to A Cup of Joe. As always, I'm your host, Joe. This morning's roast that we've got is the Sumatra roast from Salt Spring Island, so just across the bay, if you will. And it's quite delightful. If you are an avid coffee drinker, you'll know that Sumatra is one of my favorite types of roasts. It's usually darker and richer. There's usually some smoky flavors involved. So let's give it a little sniff, shall we? That's a good start. Let's give it a sip. That's good. It's nice and rich and deep. There's definitely some smoke off the top, but a little bit of caramel in there as well. It's a good cup of coffee. Well, now it's part of Cup of Joe, where I bring you a little bit of encouragement from the Bible. And before we do, I just thought I would share some encouraging words from my grandfather. My grandfather used to tell me all the time, he said, "Joe, life is tough, and then you die." Great words to live by. I want to read to you out of the book of James, where it talks about difficulties that we face in our lives. And why don't you just in the comments right now, if you're facing a difficulty and you want to share it, you can type it in the comments. I'm going to be responding to them later. I'd love to hear from you. But this is what James says about difficulties. James was the half-brother of Jesus and one of his disciples, and he wrote a letter, and these are his words. He says, "Dear brothers and sisters, when troubles of any kind come your way, consider it an opportunity for great joy. For you know that when your faith is tested, your endurance has a chance to grow. So let it grow. For when your endurance is fully developed, you'll be perfect and complete, needing nothing." You know, when I think about difficulties in my life, counting it as joy, thinking about it as a joyful experience is not on the top of my list, right? It's like, oh, I've got a bill coming out tomorrow. This is not a joyful experience, right? When we face difficulties or trials of any type, joy is not usually the first thing that comes to our mind. And I don't know what you're going through this morning or this week. I don't know what difficulties you're facing. But what James is telling us here is not that God causes difficulties or puts difficulties into our lives. What he's saying is that difficulties are an opportunity for God to produce in us character. Lots of times we like to use this imagery of mountaintop moments in our lives, right? Things where things are great, and then valleys in our life. Times where things are very difficult or hard. And I was thinking about that the other day, and I kind of had this interesting image. It's interesting that in mountaintops, almost nothing grows. It's a very barren, very desolate place. And sometimes when you've reached the top, when you're in the mountaintop moments of your life, even though everything looks great, your soul can be barren and isolated and alone. But interestingly enough, if you go down into the valleys, go down into where things are difficult, it's teeming with life. There's life everywhere. Now, obviously, this is an imperfect illustration, but how often is it that in our pain, in our difficulties, in our struggles, we actually feel closer to God than maybe when life is going amazing and great? And this is a little bit about what James is getting at here. It's that in the difficult times, we can lean into God instead of pull back away from Him. And I just want to give you a little bit of encouragement that difficulties don't come from God. In fact, if you read down a little bit further in the chapter, he says, "Don't be misled, my dear brothers and sisters. Whatever is good and perfect is a gift coming down to us from God our Father, who created all the lights in the heavens. He never changes or casts a shifting shadow." You think about a shadow as the sun moves, it moves back and forth, or maybe shadows shifting in an alleyway dark at night kind of this sketchy, immovable uncertainty. But God is the Father of lights, and every good and perfect gift comes from Him. So I don't know what you're facing, but my prayer for you this week is that you would experience God's joy. And in fact, why don't you write in the comments some things about God's character that bring you joy, that bring you peace, and bring you hope. I would love to pray for you right now. So let's just pray. Father, I just pray for everyone who's watching right now. God, I don't know the difficulties that they're facing in their life, but God, I just pray that you would be with them in the midst of those difficulties. That this would be a time for character to grow, time for them to become more and more like you, Jesus. Amen. Well, friends, it's time for one final sip. Right on. Well, I'm your host, Joe, and this has been A Cup of Joe.